The Republic of the United States of the Seven Netherlands was at war with their lord, the King of Spain. Since 1621, they were facing off with the 24-year-old King Felipe IV, who was also King of Portugal and ruler of a bunch of other places. Felipe was heavily coached by his Valido, or First Minister, the 42-year-old Gaspar de Guzman, Count of Olivares, Duke of Sanlúcar. Olivares was a huge fan of King Felipe's grandfather, the late King Felipe II, who had provoked the rebellion in the Low Countries with strict religious and economic policies some 60 years ago. The Spanish king's representative in the Netherlands was Felipe's aunt, 63-year-old Governess-General Isabel Clara Eugenia. In the Habsburg Empire, 51-year-old Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand II had been fighting Protestants for 10 years. He had just made peace with King Christian IV of Denmark and Norway, but the war wasn't over yet, with Lutheran King Gustav Adolf of Sweden preparing to join the fight in support of the Protestants. Meanwhile, France was ruled by 28-year-old Roman Catholic King Louis XIII and his first minister, the 44-year-old Armand Jean du Plessis, Duc de Richelieu et Fronsac, aka Cardinal Richelieu. Though Louis was married to the King of Spain's sister, Anna Maria Mauritia de Austria, he wanted to destroy the House of Austria. France was fighting Spain and the Habsburg Empire in the Mantuan Succession War in northern Italy, supported the Republic financially in their war against their lord, and backed whoever was fighting Emperor Ferdinand in the empire. King Louis's sister, Henriette Marie, was married to the 28-year-old King of England, Scotland and Ireland, Charles I. He also waged war with Spain and supported the Republic with the Treaty of Southampton. However, he had yet to honor its conditions. King Charles, who considered himself a God-appointed ruler, had recently dismissed his parliament, which questioned his rule. But his efforts on the continent failed, and cut off from money, he was trying to make peace with Spain. The Dutch Republic was ruled by the States General filled with deputies from its 7 independent states. Captain General of the Republican Army was 45-year-old Prince Frederik Hendrik van Oranje-Nassau, who was also the stadholder or governor of Holland, Zeeland, Utrecht, Gelderland and Overijssel. His cousin, 55-year-old Count Ernst Casimir von Nassau-Dietz, was stadholder of Friesland, Groningen and Drenthe. In the field, the stadholder duo faced the commander-in-chief of the royal forces in the Spanish Netherlands, their 56-year-old cousin, Count Hendrik van den Berg. But many Spaniards suspected Count Hendrik of treason. They feared he would sell out the southern Netherlands to the Nassau clan. He had no intention of doing this, but after he lost the vital city of 's-Hertogenbosch, most wanted him gone. Now that we're all caught up, let's dig into the final episode of this series. Governess-General Isabella desperately wanted peace before Prince Frederik Hendrik grabbed all the Spanish Netherlands. King Felipe, ignoring Count Duke Olivares' protests, agreed to leave that swamp. The secret talks with a small group of people were codenamed the Melancholy Plea of the Widow and Heirs of Slagmuller. Slagmuller was the prince's negotiator, and the widow was the Governess-General. But the talks leaked, and the States General had to forward King Felipe's offer to all 7 states. And all hell broke loose in the Republic. Some states wanted peace, the usual suspects didn't. The talk stalled, and Prince Frederik Hendrik presented plans for a glorious military victory to break the impasse. Paradoxically, the Remonstrants were in favor. Yes, they wanted peace, but they figured that the increase in taxes to pay for the campaign would cause a riot and end the war more quickly. The Contra-Remonstrants were contra. No, they didn't want peace, but they refused to fund an offensive war while Arminians were still in local and state governments. Since Holland, split between Arminian and Gomarian towns, was deadlocked 5 votes against 5, no money was made available for a campaign. Despite having the largest army available yet, Prince Frederik Hendrik refused to enter the field without payment secured up front. He only repaired the fortifications in 's-Hertogenbosch and Wesel and started upgrading the court he had inherited from his half-brother, Prince Maurits. Unlike Prince Maurits, Prince Frederik Hendrik was a man of refined tastes, many intellectual interests, and grand dynastic ambitions. With his wife Amalia, he developed his court into one of European allure, sumptuous and regal. They became quite the glamour couple. Fridalia? Amaderic? He spent big to renovate and redecorate his palaces, most notably the Palace Noordeinde in the center of The Hague, his country estate at Honselersdijk, his palace in Rijswijk, and his castle Bouvigny near Breda. He built new ones in the French style, like the Huis ten Bosch on the city's edge. Even while on campaign, he was involved in the designs down to the tapestries and the garden layouts. The prince supported the patronized artists in the Republic, like Rembrandt van Rijn, Jan Lievens, and Gerard van Honthorst, but also the Southern Baroque artists, like Antoon van Dyck and Peter Paul Rubens. Rubens was practically family. Christina von Dietz was the bastard daughter of Anna of Saxony, Frederik Hendrik's half-brother Maurits's mother, and Jan Rubens, Peter's father. Got that? Whenever the Prince of Orange was away on campaign, Princess Amalia kept Frederik Hendrik up to date with all the goings-on in The Hague through the prince's secretary, the stadholder's highly cultured artistic and intellectual sparring partner, Constantijn Huygens. Huygens, who joined the prince in the field, kept Amalia up to date on military news and her husband's health, which declined steadily. The constant campaigning and tough camp life gradually destroyed the stadholder's health. Most agonizingly, the prince suffered from gout attacks, a congenital arthritic inflammation of the joints, and was therefore often missing in action, sending other generals into the field. In 1630, Overijssel and Utrecht instigated the Acte de Survivance for the stadholder. This act declared the stadholderates hereditary. Eventually, other states followed suit. This turned the stadholdership into more of a kingship. The prince, always looking for ways to raise the status of his house, was over the moon. In February 1630, the West India Company, inspired by Admiral Piet Hein's capture of the Silver Fleet, seized Olinda in Brazil and started driving out the Portuguese by seizing places left and right. Spain was really not happy, and Portugal even less. Emperor Ferdinand was also unhappy. In June 1630, King Gustav of Sweden landed in Pommern with 12,000 troops to rescue the Habsburg Protestants, and his army was growing. Emperor Ferdinand wanted to end the Mantuan succession war to have more resources to deal with them and started peace talks with France. France's negotiating power weakened when Spain captured Mantua on July 18, 1630, but then Charles-Emmanuel, the Duke of Savoy, died a week later. He was succeeded by his son, Victor Amadeus, who was married to King Louis's younger sister, Christine. Things got worse again for France when King Louis fell ill, possibly from the same illness that had killed the Duke of Savoy. A few months later, the king was at death's door and received the sacrament of extreme unction on his birthday, September 17th. At the same time, Cardinal Richelieu was fending off plots against him left and right, most notably from the king's mother, Maria de Medici. As a result, Père Joseph, the French negotiator in the Habsburg Empire, couldn't get an answer from anyone in the French government concerning these peace talks. So he signed the crappy Treaty of Ratisbonne on October 13, 1630. But then King Louis miraculously recovered, and he refused to ratify it. Soon after, the French retook Mantua, and when heavy rain and the plague doomed the siege of Casale, the Spanish cried uncle and called for a truce. In November, King Charles concluded peace with Spain. The Republic was furious that he simply ignored the Treaty of Southampton again. But Charles claimed that the urgent necessity of his affairs had obliged him to reach an agreement with Spain. Following in the footsteps of his dad, King James, he started kissing up to the King of Spain to become besties and marry off his kids to the Spanish kids so they could become one big happy family. In June 1631, France and the Emperor ended the Mantuan succession war with the Treaty of Cherasco. Charles Gonzaga, the Duke of Nevers, was confirmed as Duke of Mantua and Monferrato, with minor concessions made to Savoy. Spain got nothing. The Spanish land army in the Low Countries was failing, but Count Duke Olivares boosted Spain's investments in the Armada de Flandes, the Dunkirk privateers. They should ramp up the attacks on the Dutch merchant vessels and cripple the Republic's economy. Their lightning-fast ships bested the Dutch admirals at every turn, and blocking Dunkirk harbor with a fleet was simply too expensive. Dunkirk's threat had to be eliminated from land. So, the States General told Prince Frederik Hendrik to take care of it. The prince didn't want to, God save us from field battles, but he headed out with an army that put Count Maurits's 1600 campaign to shame. First, the prince moved on Emmerich to confuse everyone. There, he embarked 15,000 foot and 3,000 horse on 3,000 ships and sailed to IJsendijke. On May 31st, 1631, he moved on Watervliet with 80 field cannons and a massive impedimenta carrying a ton of supplies. The ultra-methodical Frederik Hendrik arrived in Maldegem and built a bridge across the canal between Ghent and Bruges. Those in Flanders were freaking out. Then the stadholder was told that Álvaro de Bazán y Benavides Marqués de Santa Cruz was a mere 2 miles away with 14,000 Spanish troops. The prince was like, rock and roll! But the state's deputies were like, settle down there, Skippy. Frederik Hendrik told them that the honor of the state and army was at stake. But the deputies told him that it was only now seen how little affection he had toward the state, since he, alone in his satisfaction of his ambition, wanted to risk the whole prosperity of the country. The prince fumed with rage, but the deputies had the final say and forced the captain general to retreat. The Spaniards laughed and laughed. The Brussels government assumed the prince was running scared and decided on a swift counterstrike. Count Johan von Nassau-Siegen and the commander of the Spanish naval forces in the Low Countries, Francisco de Moncada y Moncada Marqués de Aytona, were put in charge of a fleet of 35 frigates, 12 large barges, and 6,000 men. They would capture some Zeeland islands. Prince Frederik Hendrik immediately sent troops to several hotspots, sailed to Bergen-op-Zoom with 10,000 men, and gathered all the Holland and Zeeland warships at Zaaftingen, but the Spanish artillery kept them from advancing. The next day, Vice Admiral Marine Solar Zeeland fleet helplessly watched the Spanish fleet make a beeline for Tolen. The Zeelanders were dead in the water because of the tide and wind. However, Colonel Thomas Morgan and 2,000 English waded waist deep through the mud and reached the island in time to prevent a landing. Low tide stranded Count Johan's fleet at Tolen's coast. They refloated when the tide came up, but that same tide refloated Hollar's fleet. Now the Dutch had the weather gauge and closed in fast. The Spanish ships fell back to the Slaak, a narrow stream to the north. On the evening of September 12th, the state's fleet, outnumbered as they were, attacked the Spanish. The fierce battle lasted all night. In the end, many Spanish ships were driven aground, and 4,000 crewmen were captured. Marquis d'Aytona managed to escape with only 2 ships, while Count Johan boarded a sloop and fled to Prinsenland. His cowardly retreat earned him the mocking nickname Jan de Mosselman, John the Mussel Catcher. In the Habsburg Empire, King Gustav, backed by money and troops from France, the Republic, and secretly England, was on a winning streak. The King of Sweden had taken the Nassau School of Military Science and elevated it to an art form. Still, Johan Cerclas, Count of Tilly, captured and decimated Magdeburg. Gustav won at the Battle of Breitenfeld near Leipzig, then Tilly defeated the Swedes at the Battle of Bamberg, but was shot in his thigh at the Battle of Rhein. Tilly died of a bone infection 15 days later on April 30th, 1632, aged 73. In France, Cardinal Richelieu, fed up with troublemaker number 1 King Louis's mom, Maria de Medici, exiled her. She went to Brussels. In the Republic, an exile returned. In the summer of 1631, 10.5 years after his legendary escape from Loevestein Castle, Hugo de Groot re-entered the Republic to continue his work. De Groot assumed Prince Frederik Hendrik wouldn't arrest him. The prince had allowed Arminian church leaders like Johannes Uyttenboga to return and was rumored to have helped 7 remonstrant ministers escape from Loevestein. But de Groot was a politician who had been convicted of high treason. When news of his return reached The Hague, an arrest warrant was issued. After a failed attempt by the Arminians in the States of Holland to grant the scholar amnesty, a price was put on Hugo's head. He once more escaped to Paris to become the French ambassador to Sweden. He died on August 28, 1645, after barely surviving a shipwreck at Rostock. He was 62 years old. His body was returned to his homeland and was laid to rest in the Nieuwe Kerk in Delft, across from the Orange Nassau Mausoleum. In early 1632, René de Renesse, Count of Warfusset, the King of Spain's accountant, showed up in The Hague and told the States he was fed up with deadbeat Felipe. He planned to enter the service of the King of France, but if the States gave him a better offer, he'd incite a revolt against the king in the Spanish Netherlands. Please fork over an advance of 100,000 crowns and you got a deal. The States decided to play ball. On May 22, 1632, the States General published a manifesto calling on the southern states to throw off the heavy and unbearable yoke of the Spaniards and join the Republic. They'd keep their privileges and religion. The king's ministers in Brussels were shook. This move undermined everything. Spain's influence was weakening, and the only thing they still had going for them was the Roman Catholic faith. If the North allowed its subjects to keep their precious religion, well then they might as well pack it in. Warfusset told the Prince of Orange, who was preparing to march on Antwerp, to take Maastricht instead. From there, it was a hop, skip, and a jump to Brussels. But that was deep in Spanish Netherlands territory. Well, Count Hendrik van den Berg, beyond fed up with the constant accusations that he was a traitor, figured, might as well do what they're accusing me of, and joined Warfusset in his treason. The Count guaranteed the States Army safe passage along the Maas River. The timing couldn't be better. Governor-General Isabella had just sent a chunk of the Spanish-Flemish army to the Pfalz with Don Gonzalo Fernandez de Córdoba. On June 1, 1632, Prince Frederik Hendrik marched along the Maas with 17,000 foot and 4,000 horse. In his pocket, the States Generals promised to offer freedom of religion to the cities in exchange for one church for the Reformed. Count Ernst Casimir would take on Roermond, Colonel Johan van Wijnbergen headed for Stralen, and Frederik Hendrik went to Venlo. Venlo and Stralen surrendered within a day. At the same time in Liège, Count van den Berg and a group of nobles called the Conspiracy of Nobles published manifestos to incite a revolt. They accused the Spaniards of unbearable arrogance against the noblemen of the loyal states. Let's kick them all out. At Roermond, Count Ernst Casimir was inspecting the digging efforts when he drew fire. He jumped off his horse to seek cover in a trench, but he was struck in the head by a bullet fired from the city. He died 3 hours later. He was 58 years old. When Frederik Hendrik heard about his cousin's death, he marched his entire army to Roermond and arrived the next day. The following afternoon, the town surrendered. In the terms, Catholicism was allowed, and the clergy kept their church property and revenues, but the city had to hand one church to the Reformed worship. Next on the list was Sittard in the county of Jülich. It surrendered after a 3-hour siege. Maaseik and Aken-Lens fell in states' hands soon after. Then the state's army headed for Maastricht. Maastricht had been in Spanish hands since Alessandro Farnese captured it in 1579, 53 years ago. The town had tall medieval walls, but had since been heavily fortified with earthen bastions and ravelins. Guillaume de Bet, Baron of Leyde, who had temporarily replaced his uncle as governor, was strong, loyal to Spain, and had a garrison of 3,000 men. On June 10, 1632, Prince Frederik Hendrik reached Maastricht, surrounded the town, and started digging the circumvallation and contravallation lines. They built bridges across the Maas River to complete the circle. Leyde's men sortied valiantly as the French and English dug approach trenches toward the town. Governor-General Isabella recalled Commander Córdoba to join Marquis de Santa Cruz, who had gathered an army at Tienen and relieved the town together. But the vessels across the Maas were sunk, and Córdoba set up camp on the south side of the river. When Santa Cruz joined him, their combined force of 18,000 foot and 6,000 horse outnumbered Frederik Hendrik's army. However, the Spanish couldn't find a vulnerable spot in the defenses. They would wait for reinforcements. Enter renowned commander Gottfried Heinrich Graaf zu Pappenheim. He and his imperial army of 12,000 foot and 4,000 horse made camp at Meersen. The Spanish relief army now totaled 30,000 foot and 10,000 horse. Frederik Hendrik, caught between two enemy forces, recalled Count Wilhelm von Nassau-Siegen and his 3,000 from Flanders. Pappenheim boasted he'd blow away the Dutch from Maastricht. He and Córdoba each launched an attack on the lines on both sides of the river. Frederik Hendrik was bedridden from a nasty gout flare-up, but he got up and visited all the danger zones. His men, inspired by the sight of the white feathers off his hat, probably, drove the armies off. Pappenheim lost 1,500 men. The general tried again, was beaten back again, and didn't bother with the third attempt. He retreated to Navenje to block the state supply lines and besieged the besiegers instead. Frederik Hendrik was like big whoop. He had ammunition and provisions for 2 months. Though his communication lines were cut, he continued the siege. Meanwhile, the garrison sortied like mad, mainly targeting the English approach trench, but both the French and the English reached the broad dry moat. They dug 60-foot deep tunnels under it, got to the walls, and placed the mines. On August 21st, 1632, in the middle of the night, they blew up the Brussels gate and breached it. Maastricht, fearing a repeat of the violent sacking of the town in 1579 if they held out any longer, surrendered the following morning on the same terms as Venlo and Roermond. But the city was punished for holding out too long and had to give up 2 churches instead of 1. Still, the town was granted freedom of religion. On August 23, 1632, the garrison marched out with honors of war. Córdoba and Pappenheim, still camped nearby, were running low on supplies and withdrew. Soon after, Frederik Hendrik seized the entire state of Limburg and Overmaas and took Orzau for good measure. The Stedendwinger strikes again. However, the prince was bummed. The vacant stadholderates went to Ernst Casimir's son, the 20-year-old Heinrich Casimir von Nassau-Dietz, and not to the prince. Onward to Brussels! Well, no. Count Hendrik van den Berg convinced fewer defectors than he'd hoped, and a large-scale uprising this ain't. Most of the rebellious southern nobles thought the heretic Dutch were icky and turned to Cardinal Richelieu instead. The state's deputies in the field decided not to risk marching on Brussels. It was too late in the year and the supply lines would get too long. Meanwhile, the government in Brussels declared Van den Berg a mutineer and traitor, replaced him with Marquis d'Aytona, and put a large reward on the count's head. Hendrik fled to Holland, where he and his followers switched sides and entered the state service. He never rode out again, though, since the Dutch didn't trust him either. But as the peace talks continued, with the lists of demands shrinking on both sides, the Spanish envoys got cocky, because something, or should I say someone, went down in the conflict next door. On November 16, 1632, King Gustav and 18,000 men attacked General Albrecht von Wallenstein's 12,000 camped at the recently captured Leipzig. A few hours into the battle, General Pappenheim, whom Wallenstein had sent away earlier, returned with some of his men balancing the numbers. The generals proceeded to wipe out 60% of the Swedish infantry, but Pappenheim was fatally wounded and died. He was 38 years old. The smoke from the burning houses in nearby Lützen blew across the battlefield, making it almost impossible to see. In the afternoon, the battle order collapsed. King Gustav, trying to rally his infantry, ran into an imperial cavalry squadron. He was shot in the arm, then in the back and head, and fell to the ground. When his horse returned to camp covered in blood, everyone realized the king was dead. Bernhard, the Duke of Saxe-Weimar, immediately assumed supreme command, and the Swedes went berserk to avenge their fallen king. Wallenstein's troops were in bad shape, and after Pappenheim's cavalry bailed, the general ordered the retreat at 5 p.m. The Swedes recovered the king's body, buried under a heap of corpses on the imperial side. The King of Sweden was succeeded by his 6-year-old daughter Christina. Privy Council Chancellor Axel Gustafsson Oxenstierna of Södermöre took over the government. He decided that if Sweden wanted their investment back, they had to continue the war. And then Prince Frederik Hendrik's nephew, Friedrich V, who was on his way back to the Republic after he had tried and failed to get King Gustav on board for his plans to get the Pfalz back, caught an infection. On the morning of November 19, 1632, he died of a pestilential fever. He was 36 years old. His heir, 15-year-old Karl Ludwig, would continue the fight for the Pfalz. The death of the Swedish hero was a massive blow to Protestants everywhere, but a boost for the Roman Catholics. Meanwhile, the negotiations between the Republic and Spain continued. Governess-General Isabella only insisted on one point, or else King Felipe would never be on board. The Dutch had to leave Brazil. In exchange, they'd pay the WIC compensation and return Breda. The Dutch wanted all the Meierij, the vast rural area around 's-Hertogenbosch, which had been in dispute ever since the capture of that town in 1629. They also wanted Breda and Gelden. They wanted guarantees about tolls in the Flemish ports and only peace in Europe, not in the East or West Indies. On June 11, 1633, Prince Frederik Hendrik moved on Rheinberg. Those in Rheinberg were like, everyone say it with me now. Aw man, not this again. The fortifications weren't great and the garrison was weak. The prince started shelling the town from 3 sides and dug 2 trenches toward the city. Marquis d'Aytona tried to come to the rescue with 14,000 men, but he couldn't cross the Rhine. Still, he seized Mazeik, Weert and the strategic Stevensweert, cutting the Republic off from Maastricht. Meanwhile, the besiegers used galleries to cross Rheinberg's moat and began undermining the gates on both sides. 2 mines blew up, creating breaches, and 2 storms later, Rheinberg surrendered on July 2, 1633. In August, the prince had to show his hand. What did he want from peace with Spain? Well, the Meierij, guaranteed tolls in Flemish ports, and keep Brazil. Cardinal Richelieu was like, interesting. The prince was team war now. Quick, Louis, give him something. Keep the war fires burning. Louis told Frederik Hendrik that he considered sending over his army to team up with his army. In other words, France would declare war on Spain. There was a catch. Neither party could negotiate for peace or truce with Spain without the other's permission. This meant the war could continue for years, decrease Holland's influence, and increase the stadholder's power. The prince was like, interesting. Frederik Hendrik and Attorney General Adriaan Pauw, who sided with Holland and Amsterdam in their wish for peace, got into a big fight over the French offer. It was the first epic battle between stadholder and Attorney General since Johan of Oldenbarneveld's fall. Then, Governess General Isabella died on December 1st, 1633. She was 67 years old. With a new Governor General incoming, her death kinda killed the peace talks. However, the increasingly Arminian Holland voted against breaking them off, a win for Pauw. But the prince won over Utrecht and Gelderland and pushed Holland off the proverbial cliff. On December 9th, the States General voted 5-2 to break off the talks. Game, set and match, Frederik Hendrik. Before her death, Governess General Isabella had already called on the Cardinal Infante Fernando de Austria to come and replace her. But King Felipe's younger brother wanted to arrive in style with an impressive army. Since a sea voyage was too risky with the Dutch fleets abound, Fernando took the scenic route along the long Spanish road. Underway, he would help his brother-in-law, King Ferdinand III of Hungary, the emperor's son and heir, who was busy fighting the Heilbronn League, a new alliance between Sweden and German Protestant allies. But disease slowed the Cardinal Infante down, and once underway again, he lost many men hacking his way through the Swedes. He asked General Wallenstein to send him 4,000 horse, but his request was denied. Rumors flew that General Wallenstein was considering switching sides. When Emperor Ferdinand put a price on his head, the general and his men fled to Geb to do a Hendrik van den Berg and join Team Sweden. Alas, on February 25, 1634, General Wallenstein and his most trusted officers were killed at Geb Castle. The stellar 1634 campaign in the Republic involved the Marquis of Aytona besieging Maastricht. He grabbed a few castles, but when Frederik Hendrik in turn threatened to besiege Breda, the Marquis backed down. That's it. That's all that happened. Meanwhile, the Cardinal Infante joined up with King Ferdinand and his imperial army and defeated the Protestants at the Battle of Nördlingen. A few months after this resounding victory, Fernando entered Brussels in a glorious parade fit for a Governor General of the Lord of the Netherlands. After the Nördlingen victory, the imperial army steamrolled over just about everyone in Germany. By May 1635, the electors of Saxon and Brandenburg chickened out of the Swedish alliance and made a separate peace with the emperor. Several other Protestant princes joined this Peace of Prague. The Prince of Orange with his infamous diplomatic skill and François van Aerssens with his even more infamous diplomatic skill negotiated an excellent offensive and defensive alliance with the King of France against Spain. Under Frederik Hendrik's supreme command, the Prince, King and Cardinal planned a joint invasion of the southern Netherlands. Though, they'd first try to move the southerners to revolt against the Spaniards. The rebels would get their own sovereign federal state following the Swiss model, with their rights and religion protected by the French King and the States General. But if they refused to switch sides voluntarily, the entire territory would be divided between allies along language borders. The French-speaking states in West Flanders falling to France, with Antwerp, Ghent, Bruges, Mechelen and the rest going to the States. Holland resisted. If any conquered places, but most terrifyingly Antwerp, joined the Republic and was allowed to recover, their economy, but most dramatically Amsterdam's, would be doomed. The Orthodox Calvinist unleashed on Frederik Hendrik because France demanded that Protestants in newly conquered areas worship in private to not upset the Pope and other Catholic anti-Habsburg powers. How could he allow the political principles of the Commonwealth to be undermined like this? The mild-mannered prince answered. How so? For we in the East Indies tolerate the heathen idolatry of the nations under our obedience. The Roman ceremonies are not so bad. We have coveted freedom of religion from the Roman Catholics, and should we deny it to them if they in turn demand it from us? In this way, we would fully justify their behavior to us. It is better to gain places by admitting the Roman religion than to waste much blood in vain before it is obtained at last or not at all. In the end, the Traité de Partage was signed on February 8, 1635, and King Louis declared war on Spain. In the spring of 1635, a French force commanded by Gaspard de Coligny, Duc de Châtillon, and Urbain de Maillé-Brézé fought their way through the Cardinal Infante's army and joined the States Army at Maastricht. Supreme Commander Frederik Hendrik, with a united army of 32,000 foot and 9,000 horse, went after Brussels. They headed for Tienen first to fight the Cardinal Infante, but Fernando retreated beyond Leuven. On June 1st, the Franco-Dutch army took Tienen by storm, and despite the prince's order, it was severely plundered, and most houses were burned to the ground. When the united army crossed the Deile River, Fernando fell back to the other side of Brussels. Though Marshal Brézé and his cavalry rode up to the gates of Brussels to claim it, they got fired at and withdrew. Frederik Hendrik prepared to surround the city, but the French whined their poorly supplied troops were in bad shape. The prince, frustrated, humored them, fell back and besieged Leuven instead. But the Leuven citizens and students didn't want to become another Tienen and refused to surrender. Meanwhile, the French army disintegrated because of starvation and disease. The prince gave the French 30,000 pounds of bread and sent the sick to Dutch hospitals, but he couldn't do more. The French wanted to end the Leuven siege, despite the prince's proof that the town would fall in a few days. But again, he humored them and marched back to Roermond and Venlo to besiege Gelden. But the Spanish emerged from the garrison towns and started to encircle the weakened troops. When Imperial Army General Ottavio, Prince of Piccolomini, and 15,000 Croats came to the rescue and defeated Frederik Hendrik's rearguard, the Franco-Dutch army, having already lost 17,000 men in this campaign, hastily retreated. The French quickly blamed Frederik Hendrik for the failed campaign, but he scolded them for not having paid their troops for 5 months and allowing them to starve. The French force left the country and the campaign was over. The states were livid. What a waste of money and people. Meanwhile, the Cardinal Infante was like, "Vamonos!" He captured most of the Meierij and marched toward Kleve. He seized Dies, Goch, Gennep and the city and castle of Limburg along the way, and then overran and occupied the Duchy of Kleve with the imperial troops. The Republic was in shock at this sudden reversal of fortune, but that wasn't the worst of it. On July 28, 1635, in the middle of the night, Lieutenant Colonel Adolf von Eindhous attacked the Schenkenschans with 500 German mercenaries because he had heard only 150 men were guarding the place. There were, in fact, only 60, and due to budget cuts, a guard ship had left the day before. Commander Velderen tried to fend off the attack with his half-dressed, half-armed garrison, but by 3 a.m. they were overrun and killed. Schenkenschans was in Spanish hands. Well, that's not good. They could now attack the Republic's heartland using the Rhine River or invade the country using the Waal and Maas rivers. Count Duke Olivares was happy. Prince Frederik Hendrik was mad. The Captain General dropped everything and advanced on the fort that same night. Since 2 rivers formed the moat around the Schenkenschans, a storm was impossible. Trenches were tricky because of the waterlogged terrain, but the prince would take the Schenkenschans back even if it took him all winter. He'd starve the place out while shooting it to smithereens. Frederik Hendrik seized some strategic posts, made 3 camps, and inundated the area to stop a Spanish relief force. States cannons blasted the fort from 3 sides, joined by gunboats on the Waal. The effects of the shelling were brutal. According to eyewitnesses, one could hear the screaming and crying in the sconce while the air was filled with smoke and flying debris for 2 hours on end. Olivares urged the Cardinal Infante to hold the Schenkenschans because it was more important than conquering Paris. So Fernando and Prince Piccolomini tried everything to relieve the fort and seized Castle Bijland. In August, the Marquis of Aytona, who had caught a fever at the siege, died. He was 58 years old. The new commander-in-chief was Paul Bernard, Comte de Fontaine. On November 30th, Schenkenschans governor Eindhous was shot in the back and died. The governor of Breda, Gomard de Fourdin, took over from him. In December, Prince Frederik Hendrik transferred command of the 30,000 men at the fort to his cousin, Count Johann Moritz von Nassau-Siegen. When the Count took the large redoubt in front of the Schrenkenschans, the Cardinal Infante organized peace talks in Kranenburg. He proposed to exchange Schrenkenschans, Goch, Breda, Kleve, Gennep and a large sum of money for Dutch Brazil, Venlo, Maastricht and Rheinberg. But the talks ended in March 1636 with no results. By now, the situation inside the Schrenkenschans was horrific. When the imperial troops retreated, all hopes of a relief faded. Count Wilhelm quickly retook Byland Castle and Frederik Hendrik shipped in fresh troops. The Spaniards made one last sortie, to no effect. On April 29, 1636, after 9 months of hell on earth, Fourdon negotiated an honorable surrender, and 800 healthy and 600 ill soldiers could leave the fortress with simple honors of war. Those in the Republic rejoiced with bonfires and church bell ringing, while Olivares grieved losing the finest jewel that the king possessed in those lands, a blow to all of Spain. He urged the Cardinal Infante to recapture Schrenkenschans, but Fernando ignored Olivares' orders and improvised an invasion of France, taking everyone by surprise. The French defenses shockingly collapsed one after another as far as Corbie. A few months later, King Louis took to the field in person to recover the ground which had been lost by his commanders and recaptured Corbie. By the end of the year, Spain had lost most of its gains in France. King Louis, who had been subsidizing the various interventions in the Habsburg War for years now, officially joined the Habsburg War, the so-called French intervention. Meanwhile, Count Johann Maurits was about to land his dream job. The WIC was on a roll. The company men captured several islands in the Caribbean like Saba, Curaçao, Aruba, Bonaire, and St. Eustatius. Curaçao had the best harbor in the Caribbean, which was better than the Spanish colonies on the mainland. It also had a ton of useful natural resources. After the WIC started shipping in enslaved people from Africa to work on the many plantations in the West Indies, the Dutch let go of their resistance to the slave trade and joined in. After the Rio Grande was seized, the WIC sent 3,000 troops over to control Dutch Brazil and appointed a governor-general, Count Johann Maurits of Nassau-Siegen. Johann Maurits moved swiftly to push out the leftover Portuguese and captured many places. It earned him the nickname, the Brazilian. But the highly ambitious Count used the cash meant for campaigns to further expand the territories to build a city, which he named after himself, Mauritsstad or Mauritiupolis, the current Recife. Meanwhile, the Republic was going nuts over tulips. The Republic's economy was on the rise. Yes, the Spanish trade embargoes were still in place, the Dunkirk privateers were still around, and the English made trade with Italy and the Levant increasingly tricky. But the Spanish river blockades were lifted, the war next door increased food exports, and the VOC and WIC expanded their territories, making their stocks go up by 500%. And with the Swedish-Polish War over, Baltic trade resumed. Plus, the Franco-Spanish War had closed the border between the Spanish Netherlands and France, forcing the Flemish and Brabant cities to pay the Republic tolls to use the Scheldt River. In short, people were raking in money. However, new investment opportunities were rare, which led to speculation and odd investment strategies. Enter tulips. Tulips, brought over from Turkey under Emperor Charles V, became popular around 1593, when botanist Carolus Clusius at Leiden University established the Hortus Academicus and started cultivating them. The tulips with gorgeous flame patterns on the petals were very popular. We now know this was caused by viruses. Tulips in the north bloomed in April and May. During the dormant phase between June and September, the bulbs could be uprooted, moved, and traded. And out of season, people made contracts to buy the tulip bulbs in advance. As the French demand for tulips rose, those contracts became very valuable. The deeds were sold at great profit, and again, without a bulb changing hands. That's speculation. This tulip mania peaked during the winter of 1636-37, when some bulbs were worth a house. But in the end, someone needed to buy the actual bulbs. In 1637 in Haarlem, where 10 million guilders worth of flowers were up for trade, buyers didn't show up for auction, probably due to the plague. With no buyers, the demand for tulips fell, and the prices plummeted. The people, mostly the middle class, took their now worthless contracts to the courts to get their money back, but couldn't make a case. The government made some arrangements, but no one was happy. Despite what people today claim, this wasn't an economic bubble, because the economic fallout was limited to a small group of wealthy merchants and skilled craftsmen. That idea came from religious propaganda of the time, pointing out that a concentration on the earthly rather than the heavenly flower could have dire consequences. Abroad, Prince Frederik Hendrik was no longer seen as a servant of the states, but as an equal partner. After Emperor Ferdinand returned Lingen to the stadtholder, the Protestant princes in the Habsburg Empire tried to make him Prince of the Empire, him being the Count of Nassau, Lingen and Meuse and all, but the States General had refused. The French, eager to keep the Prince of Orange's head in the game, honored him by upgrading his title from His Excellency to Son Altesse, His Highness. Holland moved quickly to match France and made the prince the first noble of Holland. As such, he became the chairman of the States of Holland Assembly. Frederik Hendrik, sick and tired of constantly fighting Attorney General Pauw about every little thing, made his move to tighten his grip on government and schemed to replace him with someone more helpful to him. When Pauw's 5-year term was up, the prince sent him on a very important mission to France. When he wasn't given permission to return home afterward, the Attorney General knew his number was up. After he promised to resign from his post, Pauw could go home. However, the election for a new Attorney General didn't yield a majority vote for any candidate, so the stadtholder picked one. Jacob Cats, the pensionary of Dordrecht, known for his poetry, was a fatherly, unambitious, amiable figure. Perfect. France asked Frederik Hendrik to move on Breda to lure the Cardinal Infante's forces to him. When the scheme worked, the prince went to winter quarters. Meanwhile, the Republic tried to get some neutrality deal with the Emperor off the ground. France was furious about this, but it was moot. On February 15, 1637, Emperor Ferdinand II died. He was 58 years old. His son, the 30-year-old Ferdinand III, succeeded him. The new emperor started looking for a way to end the war. It had devolved into an absolute massacre, with millions dying, mostly because of famine and disease. Some areas had lost 50% of their population, and his imperial powers were waning. For the 1637 campaign, Count Duke Olivares planned a three-pronged invasion of France from Catalonia, Lombardia, and the Spanish Netherlands. Cardinal Richelieu renewed the treaty with the Republic and asked them to capture Dunkirk to prevent this invasion. He offered 12 tons of gold, 5,000 French soldiers, and, if they succeeded, the Republic could keep Dunkirk. Well, they didn't need to tell the States twice, and Prince Frederik Hendrik prepared to embark his army at Fort Rammekens. While the French force fought their way to Dunkirk, seizing La Russie and Maubeuge along the way, the States fleet was stuck in the harbor because of the wind. The delay lasted weeks, giving the Cardinal Infante plenty of time to get his troops to the land of Vaas and prevent a landing. When everyone started falling ill, the prince gave up, sailed to Bergen-op-Zoom, and marched his 18,000 men to Roosendaal. It was high time to get his barony, Breda, back. The prince ordered Count Hendrik Casimir, stationed at Nijmegen, to entrench at Teteringen. The count arrived before the prince and, with his cavalry, tried to take Breda by surprise, but the gates were closed in the nick of time. Frederik Hendrik arrived 2 days later and made his headquarters at his castle, Bouvigny. In record time, roads were blocked, villages captured, camps made, rivers dammed, lands flooded, and circumvallation and contravallation lines dug. The whole thing was basically a repeat of the 's-Hertogenbosch siege. The governor of Breda, de Fourdain, defended the heavily fortified town with 4,000 men, but Frederik Hendrik wasn't gonna do a Spanola, sit and wait to starve the place out. Nope, he ordered 2 trenches to be dug toward the city. The Cardinal Infante and his 16,000 foot and 3,000 horse, joined by 3,000 imperial forces, marched to Rijsbergen to relieve Breda. The prince quickly reinforced the camp with an 8-foot deep ditch. He blocked the Aa River, flooding all the lowlands, making his defensive lines pretty much inaccessible. The Cardinal Infante tried to break through the circumvallation line with brute force, but failed. After 3 weeks, he broke up camp and headed for Heusden, as if to besiege that city. The prince sent 4,000 men and some cavalry after him and strengthened the Heusden garrison, but after an unsuccessful attack on the Voornerschans, Fernando crossed the Maas to besiege Venlo. Venlo's governor, Nicolaas van Brederode, only had some 1,200 men, not enough to defend the entire town, and got the citizens involved. The Spanish dug trenches and fired at the city from 4 different camps. The city shot back, but once the Spanish set fire to the town, the citizens rebelled. Women climbed the walls and begged the Spaniards for mercy, and Van Brederode negotiated a surrender. Frederik Hendrik demanded the governor's head, but the man fled. The Cardinal Infante, surprised by this quick victory, headed for Roermond. Roermond's governor, Colonel Carpentier, had about 1,200 foot and 300 horse. The shelling began on August 29th and lasted 24 hours. Roermond resisted for 5 days, but the citizens refused to help the garrison because they wouldn't fight their natural lord and prince. So Carpentier surrendered with good terms. On September 4th, the citizens of Roermond flew all the flags to welcome His Royal Highness, the Cardinal Infante, inside. Losing Venlo and Roermond cut off Maastricht from communications, but Maastricht wasn't attacked. Then, against orders, the Cardinal Infante abandoned Breda and headed for Artois to take on the French. Meanwhile, the siege at Breda progressed like the well-oiled machine the Spanish had known and hated. Trenches got closer to the town, the besieged sorties were driven back with losses, while the besiegers' losses were minimal. At the end of August, the French and English reached the Ginneken Poort and crossed the moat using fascines. They detonated a mine under the hornwork, breached it, and seized it. A few days later, a different mine misfired, and a Dutch-Scottish attack was repelled with great loss of life. But on October 2nd, Count Hendrik Casimir seized a Half Moon and a Ravelin and drove the defenders into the city. It was over. 4 days later, Fourdon asked for an honorable surrender. After the treaty was concluded, the garrison marched out with flags flying and drums beating, all baggage, and 6 artillery pieces. Prince Frederik Hendrik, the Baron of Breda, returned to his ancestral castle. With the adjacent lands de Baronnie, the gap in the southern border between Den Bosch and Bergen-op-Zoom was closed. Olivares was very angry with the Cardinal Infante, who claimed in a pathetic letter in his defense that Breda's military value has been exaggerated. Olivares did not agree. Not only was this a highly strategic fort, but for the Count Duke, it was a symbol of all that was most glorious in the reign of Felipe el Grande, Felipe II. After overseeing repairs to the town's defenses, the prince sent the army to winter quarters. But the Spaniards weren't done yet and tried to retake Rheinberg. Ah man, not this again. They tore down the palisades, attacked the guards, and after being driven back twice, seized the bulwark and rampart. They turned back 2 of its cannons on the city. Commander Wijk assembled his men, and after a long fight drove the Spaniards out again. Wijk and 20 of his men didn't survive. The Spanish left 90 dead, and took a few wagons full of wounded to Gelden. King Felipe and Count Duke Olivares decided to increase the army size in the southern Netherlands to over 80,000 men. Once Prince Piccolomini's forces arrived, they'd have 100,000 men to attack both the States and France. But no one could agree on strategies, and by the time they developed a plan, the French and States forces were already on the move. In May 1638, the French besieged Saint-Omer, while the Prince of Orange sailed to Zeeland to attack Antwerp. The prince ordered Count Wilhelm of Nassau to take 6,000 men and seize some outer defensive works on the left bank of the Scheldt River. After he'd done that, he'd be connected to the main army at Antwerp via a pontoon bridge. On June 13, 1638, Wilhelm crossed the Scheldt River at night from Fort Liefkenshoek to capture the dike near the village of Callo. The dike was unguarded, and after seizing the Steenland redoubt and the lock, the state's forces easily captured the Callo fort. Dutch pioneers spent 4 days improving the defenses with tall earthen ramparts, but they constantly drew fire from the Santa Marie and Verrebroek forts. Count Wilhelm ordered an attack on those forts to silence them. On July 17th, Fort Weerdik was taken by assault. Fort Verrebroek was abandoned after the garrison had repulsed an attack, but Santa Marie was defended too well. Meanwhile, Cardinal Infante Fernando at Saint-Omer asked Prince Piccolomini and Thomas François de Savoie, Prince de Carillon, on their way to relieve Saint-Omer, to go with him to Antwerp immediately. He also told the Count of Fontaine to come, and even ordered the Baron of Leyde to cross the Maas and drive out the invaders. Count Wilhelm strengthened his positions while skirmishing with the gathering Spanish forces and asked the prince, still at Wau, to send more troops and supplies. On July 20th, at midnight, the Spanish army of some 8,000 men, split into 3 sections, stormed the various states' positions simultaneously to prevent the companies from coming to each other's rescue. General of the artillery, Andrea Cantelmo, attacked Fort Verrebroek with 3,000 men. Leyde, with 2,000 men, moved in from the Melselendijk, and the 2,000 men of the Count of Fuenclara and de Fontaine launched an assault from Fort Sainte Marie. Though most states' troops fought bravely to hold their positions, they were eventually driven away. After 12 hours of fighting, the Spanish ended the assault to dig in. Both sides suffered severe casualties, but Fernando ordered a second assault that night. Dutch reinforcements were underway once the weather cleared up, but Count Wilhelm heard a large Spanish force would arrive the next night. This report was false, meant to scare the Dutch. It worked. The Count made a hasty and messy retreat. The Spanish captured all the cavalry's horses, all the artillery, 3 standards, 50 flags, and 81 river barges. Over 2,000 soldiers were either killed in battle or drowned during the escape, with another 2,500 captured. An official Spanish letter claimed that Count Wilhelm's only son, 17-year-old Moritz Friedrich von Nassau-Siegen, had been taken prisoner. He was shot dead by his captors to prevent his rescue by a group of Dutch soldiers, but it's one of several stories about the young man's death. When Frederik Hendrik heard about the disaster, he abandoned the siege of Antwerp. Not because he was running scared, but because he was mad. Not at Count Wilhelm, but at Holland merchants, who had sold 300,000 pounds of gunpowder to Antwerp for its defense. Yes, free trade and all, but the prince reportedly fumed, entirely out of character, so grain of salt. You see how much patience one must have with these swindlers of merchants? I have no greater enemy than the city of Amsterdam. If I get Antwerp, I will humiliate her in such a way that she will never be able to cheer herself up again. Fernando described the win at Callao to King Felipe as the greatest victory which your majesty's armies have achieved since the war in the Low Countries began. I mean, not to brag or anything. Meanwhile, Prince Piccolomini and Prince Thomas were back on the job. They relieved Saint-Omer and later overran some Dutch outposts in Kleve. In August, Frederik Hendrik besieged Gelden, hoping to draw out the Spanish garrison stations in Venlo and Roermond. But after Callao, his army had been reduced to next to nothing, and what remained of the troops got ill. When Prince Piccolomini showed up, the Captain General broke off the siege and went to winter quarters. Frederik Hendrik returned to The Hague empty-handed, and his reputation took a severe hit. Meanwhile, the Cardinal Infante was praised to the high heavens for his immaculate defensive campaign. In 1637, the governor of Maastricht, Frédéric Maurice de la Tour d'Auvergne, Duc de Bouillon, Frederik Hendrik's nephew, converted to Roman Catholicism. The Roman Catholics rejoiced. Maastricht would soon return to the Spanish Netherlands. But nothing happened. In the spring of 1638, a French soldier, Claude de la Cour, persuaded several people to make a hole in the brick city wall in his garden so the Spaniards could sneak in. But the plot was discovered, and over 20 people were arrested and tortured. 10 were found guilty, 9 of whom were beheaded. Among them was the most well-known traitor or freedom fighter, depending on who you're rooting for, Franciscan friar Servaas Vink. During the Maastricht city wall restoration in 1906, a defensive tower in the rampart was named after him, the Pater Vink-toren. Meanwhile, the French captured Edon in Artois, but were pummeled by Prince Piccolomini on their way to Diedenhoven. The Prince of Orange was in Dordrecht planning a siege of Hulst when he heard the news. He wanted to lure the Spanish to Flanders, but he saw no options, and headed for Gelden instead. He saw no options there either, so he decided to besiege Hulst after all. With that place back in state's hands, the road to Antwerp would be wide open. However, lack of wind delayed his arrival by 9 days, giving the Spaniards plenty of time to reach Hulst. So, the prince sent his people to winter quarters. Meanwhile, Maria de' Medici was touring the Republic with Princess Amalia and asked the States General to help settle the dispute with her son, King Louis. They tried, but failed. On September 5th, 1638, just as she was leaving Amsterdam to go to England and ask her son-in-law for help, her grandson was born, the later King Louis XIV, Louis XIV, the future scourge of the Netherlands. King Charles couldn't help Maria either. Besides, he was too busy with the Scots. Charles had replaced Scotland's religious practice with an English one. The opponents to this measure issued the National Covenant, which outlined the principles of religion in Scotland. These Covenanters were kicking up a storm, so King Charles led an army into Scotland to fight the inconclusive Bishops' War. Stateside, nothing happened in 1639 except for one teensy-weensy little thing. With France and Spain at war, the Spanish road, which ran right past the French border, had become too dangerous to transport Spanish troops and supplies. So Count Duke Olivares built a fleet and rented a bunch of English vessels to ship everything to the Low Countries. In exchange for a vague promise to deliver King Charles Spanish troops to fight the troublesome Scots, Olivares demanded that England give the Spanish protection in its waters. In early 1639, the States General heard rumors that an armada was about to set sail to Dunkirk. They sent out Lieutenant Admiral Maarten Harparszoon Tromp with orders to stop it. Tromp and his 12-ship fleet began a more or less successful blockade of the Dunkirk harbor. In February, the Armada de Flandes tried to break through the blockade with 13 warships, 3 frigates, and 7 armed merchant vessels. 5 Dunkirk privateers grappled and even boarded Tromp's flagship, the Amelia, but after a brutal 4-hour fight, the Flemish flagship ran aground and was set on fire. The admiral captured 2 frigates and damaged many ships. Some 1,800 privateers lost their lives. Tromp was given all the rewards. In June, the Dutch fleet stopped and searched 3 English ships sailing from Cadiz. The Lieutenant Admiral had instructions not to mess with the English Navy, so he kept the 970 Spanish soldiers found on board and returned the vessels to King Charles with an official Dutch complaint. Tromp was given all the rewards. At the end of August, the highly experienced Spanish Admiral Antonio de Oquendo y Zandetegui sailed from La Coruña with 75 ships, including 51 warships, 1,100 cannons in all. Aboard were 8,000 sailors and 13,000 soldiers. However, most were folks who had been snatched up from the fields and streets and shoved onto the ships without as much as a how do you do. A well-trained force, this was not. The Oquendo's orders were vague. Use a half-moon formation to drive the state's fleet from the channel and deliver troops and money to Dunkirk. The Oquendo assured captains who asked for more detailed instructions, "We got this. Señores, el enemigo es poca ropa." The enemy is worth zilch. When Tromp's spies told him that the Armada was coming, he split up his fleet. Rear Admiral Joost Bankert and 15 ships went north of the Downs off the English coast. Vice Admiral Witte Corneliszoon de Witt and his 5 vessels kept an eye on the Dunkirk privateers, while he and his remaining 13 ships cruised up and down the channel. On September 15th, he saw many dots appearing on the horizon. He counted 56 sail. Hoo boy! He quickly sent one of his ships to fetch Bankert and de Witt and prepared his remaining 12 to take on the Armada. Admiral Tromp called all his captains to the Amelia and speeched. Their small fleet wouldn't sail to its doom. They'd stop that triumphant parade of Spanish flags even if it killed them. All those masts and sails were just numbers and didn't represent actual might anyway. The Spanish had too many ships and not a trained crew. They'd get confused and be doomed instead. Then he revealed his plan. On the morning of September 18th, Vice Admiral de Witt arrived with his 5 ships in the nick of time. At 9 a.m., the Armada, in half-moon formation, bore down on Tromp's 17, who faced them head-on. The Oquendo, aboard the flagship, the Santiago, had warned everyone Tromp's Amelia was his, and his alone. As the Armada closed in, Tromp ordered his squadron into the infamous keel-line formation. Like a well-choreographed ballet, all ships turned 90 degrees. The Oquendo suddenly faced a wall with rows and rows of cannons. Tromp had created one big monster ship. The Oquendo ordered his fleet to turn as well, but his sudden move created confusion. Some ships turned with him, but most didn't. The half-moon formation fell apart. Still, the Oquendo was determined to board the Amelia. However, the Santiago turned too late and sailed past its rear. The Oquendo then tried to board the second ship in line. He couldn't. The remaining ships down the Dutch column waved at him as he sailed by. No, opened fire as the Santiago sailed past. It was pummeled by the shots of the well-trained cannoneers. Masts splintered, ropes snapped, and sails ripped to shreds. 150 lay dead on the decks. The rest of the fleet recovered and closed in, preparing to return fire. But, as Tromp had predicted, they got in each other's way. The Santiago was so severely damaged it barely moved, which slowed everyone else down. According to the honor code, no one could sail past the fleet's commander. The Oquendo was too proud to allow the undamaged part of the fleet to pursue Tromp and get the glory. The Dutch did lose one ship though. The Grote Christoffel exploded by accident. The damaged armada went for anchor near Dover, where a thick fog hid them from the Dutch. Tromp didn't find them again until the following day, but there was no wind until nightfall, by which time Rear Admiral Bunkert and his 12 had joined him. That night the Dutch attacked, and the untrained Spanish crew freaked out at the relentless cannon fire. The Oquendo saw this was going nowhere fast and ordered everyone to go to the Downs in neutral English waters. The Downs was basically a large parking lot for ships, but Vice Admiral John Pennington, the guardian of the Downs, demanded the Spanish lower their flags before entering. The Oquendo was still arguing with him when Tromp, resupplied by the French overnight, reappeared the following day. Antonio ordered everyone to lower the flags, cut the anchors, and enter the Downs. The Dutch also asked Pennington permission to park their ships in the Downs. Well, sure, come on in. Now Pennington's fleet of 10 ships plus a few commandeered merchant ships lay wedged between the Spanish and Dutch fleets. Let the staring contest begin. Admiral de Oquendo got organized fast. That night, under cover of thick fog, he transferred 4,000 troops to Dunkirk ships that snuck away from the Downs. Lieutenant Admiral Tromp then blocked every exit and searched every ship that left the parking lot. But the Spanish still managed to smuggle small batches of men out. Admiral Pennington ordered Tromp to tell him whether he would dare violate English neutrality and attack the Spanish in English waters. The frazzled admiral complained that the States General hadn't sent him orders and simply told him to use his own judgment. Woe is me! For the States have put a noose around my neck, but I would never offend His Majesty in his own chamber, of course. Pennington was relieved the Dutch would behave. But then, 5 Holland ships arrived and joined Tromp's fleet, and another 5 from Zeeland with musketeers on board, and 3 more, and 8 more, and more, and more, and more, and gunpowder, and cannonballs, and fire ships. The States General and the Prince of Orange had ordered the 5 admiralties, together with the West and East India companies, to get as many ships out to the Downs as possible. In a month, an incredibly short time, Tromp had 105 sail and 12 fire ships. It only now dawned on Pennington. This was planned. Tromp did have orders, that lying bastard. Well, someone give Tromp an Oscar. The States General had given him very clear orders. Prevent the Spanish from leaving the Downs, even if it meant violating England's neutrality. Had Pennington known about these orders, it would have unleashed an international incident. As the Dutch armada grew, the Spanish armada was disintegrating. The constant fear of oncoming Dutch fire ships kept everyone awake at all hours. They lacked good food, medicine, and doctors, and many men got ill and died. Scores of dead crewmen were thrown overboard and washed ashore. Tromp didn't know how bad it had gotten for the Spanish until he received a request from the English asking him to please weigh down their dead with rocks, since bodies were piling up ashore. The Dutch fleet was incredibly well supplied. His men were only dying from boredom. Meanwhile, the King of England was price gouging the Spaniards for food, gunpowder, and ammo to force the Spanish government to send him troops. The Oquendo also really needed new masts. Tromp was like, I got you, boo, what do you need? Free of charge. Wait, what? Well, to avoid a political meltdown between the Republic and England, Tromp wanted the Spanish ships to go out to sea where he could fight them and blow those masts apart again. Otherwise, they'd all be stuck at the Downs forever. Of course, that such a delivery would humiliate the Spanish was a bonus. In the end, the Spanish accepted Tromp's offer, who also sent over men to install the masts. By now, Antonio got restless and Martin was itching to go. The Oquendo consolidated the crews on the best ships. The remaining ghost ships would be left behind. In the end, he had 53 fully manned and armed ships. Tromp's 105 were smaller, but size don't matter in the hands of a capable admiral. It was about to go down in the Downs. On October 18, 1639, Lieutenant Admiral Tromp prepared to move on the Spanish and English waters. He would take on the Santiago with 19 vessels. Vice Admiral Johan Evertsen with 15 would attack the gigantic Santa Teresa, the Portuguese flagship commanded by Lope de Oces y Cordova. A third would keep the Dunkirk fleet in check, the fourth kept an eye on the southern section of the Armada, and finally, Vice Admiral de Witt would keep an eye on the English. One wrong move and they were swimming with the fishies. But first they had to wait for a favorable wind. On October 21, 1639, in the middle of the night, the wind shifted northwest. It was on. At sunrise, the Spanish saw the Dutch fleet at full sail with 20 fireships headed north of the Armada. Everyone panicked, anchor lines were cut, and galleons bumped into each other as the Armada fled south. Around 8:30, the cannons started firing. The English were like, phew, glad we're not part of this. Then a fog rolled in, and all the cannons silenced. Half an hour later, the fog cleared, and the Spanish fleet was too close to the shore. Over 20 vessels were stranded. Some had gotten disoriented, while others ran aground deliberately. When fireships came at them, the crews abandoned ship. However, the locals who had come to watch the spectacle in droves risked life and limb to plunder the beached ships. Meanwhile, the Santiago and a group of the best ships and captains had reached the open seas and made a run for it. Tromp launched 3 fireships at the Santiago, and Evertsen sent 2 to the Santa Teresa. The Santiago dodged the 3, the Santa Teresa the 2. However, one of those hit Dutch Captain Musse's ship, who had pierced the Portuguese Goliath with his bowsprit. The little boat caught fire and sank, but slowly, so many survived. Evertsen sent more fireships to the Santa Teresa, and those hit their mark. Admiral Others had been shot and lay dead on the deck as flames slowly enveloped the massive ship until it exploded. The gigantic blast rocked Dover Castle. Only 100 survived. Meanwhile, Tromp pursued the Oquendo and 15 others. At nightfall, there was no moon, and they disappeared from view. The Dutch ships fired at will, and the inexperienced Spanish crew fled below decks. The Oquendo went after them, but at the gun deck, he only found the dead and wounded at their posts. He ordered all lights to be doused and the cannons to be silenced so he could address the freaked-out crew hiding deep in the bowels of the ship. He urged them to find courage for the love of their country and save their own lives. If they wanted to reach Dunkirk, pull it together and move! The pep talk worked. The Santiago reached Dunkirk in the morning. Though they counted 1,700 shots in her hull, only 9 other ships made it to port. The Oquendo was devastated. He said, "Now that I've brought the king's ship and his standard home, nothing rests for me but to die." He did, less than a year later. Over the next few days, the rest of the scattered Spanish Armada was hunted down and either captured or destroyed. Tromp got all the rewards, and the King of France knighted him. This victory turned out to be even more vital because the Spanish planned to team up with England and Denmark to attack Swedish and Dutch merchant ships. More about that later. Tromp was praised for his obviously awesome skills, but wasn't given enough ships to stop Dunkirk privateers who continued to merrily seize Dutch merchant vessels. This was infuriating. The Battle of the Downs had been a flagrant violation of English neutrality. A humiliated King Charles vowed revenge, but his hands were tied. Protestant England teaming up with Roman Catholic Spain to attack the Protestant Dutch would only confirm what the English already suspected. Charles was a closet Roman Catholic. Francois van Aarsens was sent to London, and with patience and extreme diplomatic skill, managed to calm everyone down. After all, King Charles was technically still bound to the Treaty of Southampton and couldn't be mad at the Republic for attacking their common enemy. But lingering resentment from this incident, plus, well, you know, the Amboina Massacre, contributed to the breakout of the First Anglo-Dutch War in 1652. But that's for another series. Charles needed money to continue the fight with the Scots. He ended his personal rule and called Parliament together for the first time in 11 years. Could they fork over £840,000, pretty please? Let's just say his demand didn't go well. Frustrated, Charles dismissed this short parliament, and the Scottish rebels invaded England in August 1640, unleashing the Second Bishops' War. This time, Charles lost, and the Scottish insurgents occupied northern England. King Charles asked Spain for money. They were willing to deal, but demanded that England declare war on the Republic and that his fleet secure the Dunkirk route. But Charles knew Spain really had no money and no ships. So, the king once more recalled Parliament to provide for the kingdom's safety and well-being, first by chasing out the rebels, and secondly by satisfying your just grievances. Parliament, exploiting the king's weak position, reversed most of his policies and made a law that prevented a king from dismissing Parliament whenever he felt like it. Thus began the Long Parliament, which ultimately spelled disaster for Charles. And that's an understatement. King Charles, eager to secure some future support should this parliament thing go sideways, reconnected with his garter knight, Prince Frederik Hendrik of Orange-Nassau. He signed off on a marriage between the prince's eldest son and heir Willem and the king's second daughter Elizabeth once she was old enough. Perhaps a Protestant son-in-law could calm Parliament down. The marriage would raise the status of the House of Nassau, but the Dutch delegates told the king that Fredalia preferred marrying Willem off to Mary Henrietta, Charles's eldest daughter. To raise the status even higher. However, the Spanish delegation had dibs on her for the Crown Prince Baltasar Carlos. But the king said nothing. He wasn't about to burn any bridges. Time for another campaign in Flanders. Yay! Prince Frederik Hendrik landed near Philippine with about 27,000 men and ordered Count Wilhelm to take 5,000 men and grab the Sint-Job and Sint-Donaas redoubts to secure the army's supply lines. The prince marched to Assenede, but the Ghent and Bruges canals were well defended, the Cardinal Infante was in Ghent, and the Count of Fontaine was already marching from Damme. The prince sent Count Hendrik Casimir and a large force ahead to Bruges, while he remained on the moors near Maldegem. At 10 p.m., the prince heard firing from Bruges and figured the count was crossing the canal. He sounded the drums, encouraging the soldiers, and showed them the towers of Bruges. Then a colonel arrived and said that Hendrik Casimir found the Bruges area impassable and awaited new orders. When the prince received word that the French had besieged Arras, the capital of Artois, he recalled Hendrik Casimir. Because the Cardinal Infante would have to take his entire force to break the Arras siege, Frederik Hendrik could seize Ghent, but those roads were also impassable. Then news arrived that the Spaniards were eyeing Breda, so Frederik Hendrik sent François de Lobespine, Marquis d'Hauterive there with 40 company foot for reinforcements. Hulst then! The prince ordered Hendrik Casimir to attack the Moervaart redoubt and told Hauterive to seize the small Nassau redoubt. On his nighttime approach, Hendrik Casimir suddenly heard many trumpeters along the line playing different melodies. The count figured a massive army lay ahead and fled. This had been a clever trick. There were no more than 50 royal soldiers near the redoubt. They just used the available trumpeters to fool the count into thinking there were many different companies in the area. Hauterive had captured the Nassau fort, but Frederik Hendrik was furious that only half his orders had been carried out. He then ordered several attacks on other forts surrounding Hulst. Count Hendrik Casimir would take the neglected Kwaadpeerschat redoubt, but he ran into Spanish troops underway. In the dark, the states and royal forces got completely mixed up, and because of the smoke from all the guns blazing, they couldn't tell each other apart. After an hour and a half of this blind fighting, both sides made an honorable retreat. During the battle, Count Willem Frederik of Nassau, Hendrik Casimir's younger brother, had 2 horses shot from under him, broke 3 rapiers, but walked away uninjured. Hendrik Casimir wasn't so lucky. During the attack on the Absdal redoubt, he was shot by a pistol from behind. The bullet passed through the girdle on the left side close between the spine and first rib. He was thrown from his horse and lay injured on the ground for a long time, being trampled by Spanish horsemen who didn't see him in the dark. But he was still alive. When a soldier tried to rob him, he shouted, "You sacramental scoundrel, let the devil come get you! Don't you see what you're doing? I'll cut off your head!" He was taken to the St. Anna fort, but surgery couldn't save him. The stadtholder died from the infected wound on July 12, 1640. He was 28 years old. With the Spaniards so well entrenched at St. Janstein, Hulst couldn't be taken. The Nassau redoubt was abandoned, and the prince embarked his troops to get to Gelden. He would weaken the Cardinal Infante's relief forces who were revving up to break up the French siege of Arras. It worked. The Fontaine came to Venlo. However, rain made a proper siege of Gelden impossible. The state's army, once more having achieved nothing, went to winter quarters, while the French captured Arras on August 9, 1640. With Count Hendrik Casimir's death, the stadholderates of Friesland, Groningen and Drenthe were up for grabs again. Prince Frederik Hendrik plotted to snatch them up before Count Willem Frederik, Hendrik Casimir's younger brother, could. The prince wasn't out to diss his relative, but wanted to combine all states under a single stadholderate to beef up his son's marriageability for the unity of the states. The States General also wanted F. Henri in charge of everything to get a grip on military spending and send some guys over to talk the states into it. Willem Frederik rushed to Friesland, where his government friends rushed through his appointment before the States General's envoys even arrived. Friesland was insulted about the States General's interference. Last they checked, they were still a sovereign state. You can't tell us what to do. They then sent deputies post-haste to Groningen to tell them to also vote for Willem Frederik. But Groningen was like, you can't tell us what to do. After some fierce discussions, Groningen and Stad en Lande chose Frederik Hendrik. Soon after, Drenthe also ignored the Frisians' plea and chose Orange. The prince, accompanied by his son Willem, raced north to be installed and secured the survivance for his son. The States General also appointed the prince stadholder of the Generality lands of Wedde and Westerwolde. The relationship between the two stadholders was tense from the start. Frederik Hendrik, miffed about missing out on Friesland, blocked Willem Frederik from rising up the ranks in the armed forces. Petty much? Meanwhile, in Brazil, Count Johan Maurits sent Cornelis Jol with 21 ships and over 2,000 soldiers to the coast of Africa. Jol captured São Paulo de Luanda in Angola, a slave trade hub, and the island of São Tomé, ending Portuguese supremacy in Africa. At the same time, the VOC had nearly wiped out the Portuguese presence in the East Indies. However, the impregnable fort of Malacca, which controlled the sea lanes of the spice trade, had remained out of reach. But then, in January 1641, the VOC teamed up with the locals and finally drove the Portuguese out. They also captured Colombo and some strongholds on the island of Ceylon. But all the action in the East and West Indies gradually ground to a halt because peace. Spain was in deep doo-doo. Not only was it fighting multiple wars it had no money to wage, it also had massive internal problems. Catalonia was fed up with Count Duke Olivares' centralization policies and the constant presence of Spanish troops in their area because of the Franco-Spanish War. Wait, we've heard this before. Cue revolt. France egged on the Catalunya peasants, which sparked the Guerra de los Segadores, the Reapers' War. This gut punch to King Felipe's rule was followed by another revolt. The Portuguese were beyond done with the Spanish government, which raised taxes, only installed Spaniards in government positions, and wanted to turn Portugal into a province of Spain, leaving the Portuguese nobles with nothing. Wait, we've heard this before. Cue revolt. When King Felipe issued an order forcing the nobility to take up arms against the insurgents in Catalonia or else lose their fiefdoms, they threw off the Spanish yoke. France got right on, egging on the Duke of Braganza to seize the Portuguese crown, and King João IV drove the Spaniards from Portugal with a single blow. England, France, and the Republic immediately recognized the new King of Portugal. The Republic sent a fleet to support King João and allowed him to recruit soldiers to fight Spain. But wait. Something. Oh, no. The Dutch realized that their successes in the East and West Indies had come at the expense of the Portuguese, not so much the Spanish, and now Portugal demanded restitution for their lost territories. Aww. On June 22, 1641, the Republic and Portugal concluded a 10-year truce in the East and West Indies. Everyone kept their properties, but the Portuguese could trade freely everywhere, severely dampening the profit margins of the VOC and the WIC. By 1643, after a string of bad business decisions, the West India Company operated on a constant verge of bankruptcy. Governor-General Johan Maurits figured it was only a matter of time before the Portuguese would come a-knocking and retake Brazil. Since his life wasn't as luxurious and splendorous as he had hoped, the Governor-General repeatedly asked to be recalled. Johan Maurits finally returned home and built his residence in The Hague, which is now a museum, the Maurits House. Soon after his departure, the West India Company fell apart. And sure enough, the Portuguese came and seized everything with treachery, revolts, and brutality until the Dutch were driven out of Brazil in 1654. The countries of Curaçao, Aruba, and also Sint Maarten are still part of the current Kingdom of the Netherlands, along with the municipalities Bonaire, Saba, and Sint Eustatius. Spain was still negotiating a marriage between Princess Royal Mary Henrietta and the Spanish Infanta Baltasar Carlos, but Spain offered things to England it could not give and made demands from King Charles he could not give, and the negotiations failed. Prince Frederik Hendrik was like, "Excuse me, coming through." For Charles, marrying his daughter off to someone of a lower standing was a considerable concession, but backed in a corner, the king agreed to a marriage between the prince's 15-year-old son Willem and his 9-year-old daughter Mary Henrietta. King Charles tried to attach some political conditions to the marriage, like an Anglo-Dutch alliance and the restoration of the Pfalz to the king's nephew and Frederik Hendrik's cousin, Karl Ludwig. But the States General and the prince shut that down real quick. Mary could not go to the Republic until she was 12, the marriageable age in England, and even then she could annul the marriage contract. In April 1641, Lieutenant Admiral Tromp and 20 warships sailed young Willem to England. On May 12, 1641, Willem and Mary Henrietta married in the chapel of the Palace of Whitehall. The wedding was followed by the bedding or coucher for the couple in front of the bride's parents and many guests. It was strictly symbolic, of course. The French were like, wait a minute, why would Frederik Hendrik accept semi-Roman Catholic relations into his family all of a sudden? Was he warming up to Spain? Frederik Hendrik cleverly used the panic to sucker Cardinal Richelieu into a new treaty. France forked over 1.2 million guilders for a new campaign and promised to invade the Netherlands again. When Spain realized everything was not going their way, they demanded instant peace with the Dutch. But a pessimistic Cardinal Infante told Madrid that as long as Orange was bound to France and in control of the States General, he saw no possibilities for a settlement with the Republic. Princess Amalia, concerned for her husband's declining health, was furious when Prince Frederik Hendrik, who hadn't fully recovered from his latest bout of gout, led his forces to Gennep. Well, woman, there's a war going on. On June 28, 1641, the state's forces started shooting at the Fort Genneper house from 4 sides and dug 2 trenches toward the stronghold. Count Wilhelm took the counterscarp, but was injured during a failed attempt to breach a dam to drain the moat. As they prepared to build a bridge across the moat instead, Wilhelm succumbed to his injuries and died on July 17, 1641. He was 49 years old. With the storm on Gennep imminent, the besieged, already down 500 men with 700 wounded, negotiated a surrender. That same day, the French seized Aire-sur-la-Lys and Artois, though they lost it again later. But these wins severely hurt Spanish morale. Frederik Hendrik once more headed for Hulst, but Spanish reinforcements were incoming. And, well, never mind. The prince returned to Bergen-op-Zoom. The main reason for this half-hearted attempt was the growing suspicion that once France conquered the Spanish Netherlands, they wouldn't stop at the Republic's border. Frederik Hendrik managed to convince Cardinal Richelieu to focus France's campaign on Catalonia the following year, let Spain deal with them for a while. Meanwhile, on November 19, 1641, Cardinal Infante Fernando went the way of oh so many governors general in the Low Countries. He died of smallpox. He was 32 years old. His temporary replacement was Don Francisco de Melo. A month later, shortly after returning from England, François van Aarsens died. He was 69. No one in the Republic was in a hurry to launch the 1642 campaign. The states weren't interested in helping France win everything while gaining nothing themselves. And Spain so longed for relief that they'd go pretty far to get it. Emperor Ferdinand, worried about losing his hereditary lands and fearing an implosion of Germany, wanted to throw in the towel in his war as well. In other words, everyone was ready to call it quits. Everyone, except France, which was snatching up places left and right, or rather north and south. At wit's end, King Felipe asked Pope Urban VIII to have a little chat with King Louis. "Can we make peace, s'il vous plaît?" The French king pointed at the participation treaty with the Republic and told him, "Not without my allies." Felipe then pleaded directly with Louis for peace. Nope, no peace without their allies. Emperor Ferdinand had better luck in his negotiations. At the end of 1641, he made a provisional treaty with the French and the Swedes. Peace talks would take place in Münster with the Protestants and in Osnabrück with the Roman Catholics. The States General was asked to also send representatives to end their war with Spain. Debates raged all over the Republic, but the prince refused to respond to direct peace initiatives. Not without our allies. While the European mainland was looking for peace, England was headed for war. The English Parliament had imprisoned several of King Charles's supporters and executed his biggest cheerleader, Thomas Wentworth, Earl of Strafford, the Lord Deputy of Ireland. With Strafford gone, the Roman Catholic Irish got worried about their safety and revolted. King Charles demanded Parliament give him an army to put it down, but the MPs didn't trust the army's commander-in-chief, aka Charles, to not use it against them. So, they demanded a say in military campaigns, a severe incursion on the king's rights. In December, Parliament gave the king the Grand Remonstrance, a list of grievances. The king was like, "Nice, toilet paper," and accused his main opponents in Parliament of treason. In January 1642, he set out to arrest 5 members of the Commons, but failed. And Parliament was mad. With Parliament controlling the London militia, Charles feared for his safety. He left London and established his court in York. Unleashed the pamphlets. People started choosing sides, Team Parliament or Team Royal. Both teams raised armies, and both teams asked the Republic for help against the other. King Charles sent Queen Henriette Marie over to get sympathy from Prince Frederik Hendrik, but more importantly, secure arms and ammunition for King Charles's militia army. As a precaution, she also brought 11-year-old Princess Mary Henrietta to live at Frederik Hendrik's court. Incidentally, on her 12th birthday a year later, Mary gave her approval of the marriage to Willem. Parliament sent over Walter Strickland, who told the States General that the fights between King and Parliament were exactly the same as those between the King of Spain and the Republic. They should become allies. The States was leaning Team Parliament, and Prince Frederik Hendrik was leaning Team Charles, but both agreed it was not in the Republic's best interest to choose sides. They refused to be dragged into more wars. The States offered to mediate between King and Parliament, and Frederik Hendrik sent Charles some money, but little else. Queen Henriette Marie had to go to Antwerp lenders to pawn off some crown jewels Charles had sent with her. She raised 1,281,700 guilders, nearly 17 million in today's dollars. On June 1st, 1642, the Long Parliament published the 19 Propositions, transferring most of the king's powers to them. Well, that would not stand. On August 22nd, 1642, the king raised his standard at Nottingham, a declaration of war, and the English Civil War was on. The king's army marched on London with 11,000 foot, 3,000 horse and 1,000 dragoons to confront the parliamentarian army under Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, and his 12,000 foot, 2,000 horse and 700 dragoons. The two armies clashed in a field battle at Edge Hill, the Civil War's first major battle. It was inconclusive and the king marched on, ultimately establishing headquarters in Oxford. Fights broke out everywhere between those loyal to the king and those who sympathized with Parliament, with both sides seizing cities and creating supply lines. The French campaign in Spain gained them a few places, but France was also dealing with internal issues. The local nobles were mad at Cardinal Richelieu's centralization policies. Wait, we've heard this before. Cue revolt. Henri Coiffier de Ruzé des Fiat, Marquis de Cinq-Mars, the king's favorite and possible lover, plotted to overthrow Richelieu. He got the Duke of Bouillon, the king's brother Gaston, Duc d'Orléans, and several French greats involved. They made a deal with Spain for support. But the cardinal found out about this secret treasonous treaty on his sickbed and told the king. The revolt ended before it had even started. Cinq-Mars was captured and executed, but the Duke of Bouillon survived, courtesy of his uncle, the Prince of Orange. However, he lost his Principality of Sedan and his governorship in Maastricht because of his treasonous connections with Spain. Prince Gaston was left out of the case, but Parliament took away his rights to the regency. Meanwhile, the king's mother, Maria de' Medici, died in Köln in July 1642, destitute and alone. She was 67 years old. Cardinal Richelieu died in December from a variety of illnesses. He was 57 years old. And on May 14, 1643, 6 months after the cardinal and exactly 33 years after his father's death, King Louis died of tuberculosis. He was 41 years old. His wife, Queen Anna, the King of Spain's sister, became regent in France until their son, the 4-year-old King Louis XIV, came of age. Gaston became her governor-general and head of the Council of State. Many feared, while others hoped, that everything would change. It didn't. Richelieu's successor was his well-trained pupil, Cardinal Giulio Raimondo Mazzarino, aka Cardinal Mazarin. Gaston and Mazarin simply continued Richelieu's policies, and France renewed their annual treaty with the Republic for a 1643 campaign. While the cardinal and the king were bedridden and dying, the governor-general of the Spanish Netherlands, de Mello, happily waltzed over France's crumbling defenses. In the spring of 1643, de Mello besieged Rocroi, a fortress town garrisoned by a few hundred French. Louis de Bourbon Duc d'Enghien, Prince de Condé, a 21-year-old but experienced commander of 22,000 men, wanted to force the Spanish into a field battle. De Mello was like, "Bring it on, kid." On May 19, 1643, 5 days after King Louis's death, the battle was on. There were wins and losses on both sides, and the outcome remained undecided for a long time. Then d'Enghien ordered a huge cavalry encirclement to attack the Spanish cavalry's rear. Everyone but the Spanish tercio fled. They continued to bravely fend off the French, but eventually they had to surrender. The Spanish losses were immense. Among the dead was the commander-in-chief of the royal forces in the Netherlands, the Count of Fontaine. Prince Frederik Hendrik wanted to take advantage of this crushing defeat and attacked Hulst. However, Commander Andrea Cantelmo, who had escaped the Battle of Rocroi with his men, occupied the Nassau redoubt. Once again, the prince gave up. The Duke of Enghien, drunk on Rocroi's victory, besieged Diedenhoven, so Frederik Hendrik dutifully made camp at Assenede and Beauchautte to prevent a Spanish relief attempt. The Spanish made camp at Zelzate to secure Sas van Gent and Ghent. The two armies started a staring contest, allowing the French to capture Diedenhoven on August 10th. The prince retreated to Bergen-op-Zoom and the Spanish to Antwerp, though the cavalries continued to skirmish. In one of these skirmishes, Frederik Hendrik's son Willem, who had just been promoted to general of the cavalry, daringly defeated the Spanish foot and horse at Borgerhout on September 4th. Naturally, the heir of the prince was highly praised for his first victory. The kid had potential. The state's army went to winter quarters early, but France was a hungry hippo and seized many cities from the Spaniards, which made the nobles in Spain mad. They blamed Count Duke Olivares for all the mess Spain was in, the various revolts, the loss of Portugal, the economic crisis, him spending money on a new royal palace during times of austerity, all while his mental health was in decline. King Felipe had to divert the bad press now attached to the royal house, and pressured by his wife Elizabeth and the court, he had no choice but to remove the Count Duke from office. Olivares died 2 years later, consumed by madness. The French wanted to renew the 1635 Treaty of Participation with the Republic, but Prince Frederik Hendrik was wary. The victory at Rocroi had set a dangerous precedent, and with the French inching closer to the Republic's border with every capture, could they be stopped once they got there? Despite the prince's reservations, the treaty with France was extended, and a new campaign was planned. On May 28, 1644, the French besieged Gravelines, assisted by Admiral Tromp and 30 Dutch warships blocking the harbor. The Spanish assembled at St. Winoksbergen to relieve the town, but dutiful Frederik Hendrik lured them away by pretending to cross the canal between Ghent and Bruges. After the French grabbed Gravelines, the prince grabbed a few redoubts, seized Assenede and dug in. On July 30th, Frederik Hendrik besieged Sas van Gent. Governor Andrea de Parrado was told not to expect any help from de Mello. He was leaving for Spain. His replacement, Manuel de Maura y Corte-Real Marqués de Castel Rodrigo, had just arrived. But Parrado wouldn't surrender just yet. The Spaniards breached the dikes and flooded the land, and with rain coming down all day, the state soldiers were stuck in the mud. There were a few skirmishes, but nothing much happened for weeks. At the end of August, Frederik Hendrik encouraged his men to dig toward the city. Sas van Gent surrendered on September 5, 1644. According to the States, a miraculous capture. The prince went to winter quarters, but Lord High Chancellor Axel Oxenstierna asked the Republic to send ships and troops. Sweden was at war with Denmark. Could everyone just stop declaring wars already? For years, King Christian of Denmark and Norway, jealous of the Swedish successes in the war and the Dutch's awesome trade, levied heavy taxes on merchant vessels using the Øresund. He even allied with Spain to destroy Dutch trade. Amsterdam wanted the States to send a fleet to teach the Danes a lesson, but the States General shrugged it off. Prince Frederik Hendrik felt the war and the Dunkirk privateers were more important than some levy beef with the Danish king. In May 1643, Sweden, feeling a little claustrophobic surrounded by King Christian's territories, picked a fight over the Øresund tolls. This unleashed the Torstensson War, or Hannibal War, named after Swedish General Lennart Torstensson and Norwegian Governor General Hannibal Sehested. Most Republican states backed Sweden and sent a fleet of 21 ships to help. The Swedish-Dutch combo fleet of 37 ships won the Battle of Fehmarn, sinking or capturing 15 of the 17 Danish vessels. But the states tapped out after that. They weren't gonna join another war. Instead, the States General sent 2 envoys to mediate between Denmark and Sweden. However, the mediators arrived with Admiral de Witt and 40 warships, just in case. De Witt was like, "Don't mind me, just cruising up and down the Baltic Sea." But the Danes refused to budge, so despite Frederik Hendrik and the French protesting this fruitless war, a fleet of 50 ships prepared to head out. When the Danish government heard what was coming their way, they started talking. On August 13, 1645, King Christian was forced to lower the tolls. The same day, in a humiliating blow for the Danes, the Second Treaty of Brömsebro ended the Torstensson War. Meanwhile, in England, Parliament got serious about war and created the permanent professional new model army of 22,000 men under Captain General Thomas Fairfax. Fairfax had gotten his military education in, you guessed it, the Republic, while serving under General Horace Vere. Fairfax even married his daughter, Anne. His second-in-command was MP Oliver Cromwell. On June 14, 1645, Fairfax and his 15,000 routed the King's 10,000 at Naseby in Northamptonshire. It proved a decisive battle, with the parliamentary forces taking over most royalist areas. Peace negotiations to end the 30 Years' War were finally underway in Münster and Osnabrück, and the Republic was still debating whether to join in to end their war with Spain. At last, the States General decided that peace could be concluded with Spain once King Felipe surrendered the entire Meierij, recognized the Dutch conquests in the East and West Indies, agreed that the Scheldt remained closed, adjusted the toll rates in the Flemish ports, and lifted the embargoes on Dutch shipping and trade. There would be no ceasefire this time. The war would continue until peace was ratified by the King of Spain. Princess Amalia talked and talked with Prince Frederik Hendrik to be in favor of peace until his ears fell off. But he was eager to have at least one glorious conquest before it was all over. However, Holland was eager to end the war and delayed the start of a new campaign. When Frederik Hendrik finally entered the field to move on Antwerp again, the French had already captured several small towns in the Spanish Netherlands and the Mardyk fort near Dunkirk. The prince asked the French marshals to hold positions for a few days to delay the Spanish so he could dig in at Antwerp, but they refused. Antwerp was out. Again. Hulst, then. Either this is one of those if at first you don't succeed, try again, or insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. Let's see. The town's governor, Jacques de Hénon du Cournet, had about 1,300 men. He moved swiftly to add a few regiments to his garrison and ended up with 2,500 foot and 250 horse in and around the place. On October 4, 1645, the state's troops arrived in Stekene with 12,500 foot, 2,500 horse and 39 cannons. They took Sint-Janstein the next day, along with several important forts like Fort Moerschans, Fort Sandberg and Fort Nassau. The prince made camp to the south of Hulst, and Field Marshal Johan Wolfert van Brederode was in the west. Pioneers started digging tunnels toward the city wall, and Frederik Hendrik ordered 4,500 foot to take 5 cannons and attack the east of Hulst. They faced off with 1,500 Spanish, but a few well-aimed cannon blasts killed 100. A single grenade that landed in the town killed a husband and wife and their 4 kids. 10 days later, state's troops occupied the eastern part of the city. The prince sent them another 1,000 horse and ordered an attack on the center of the town. Meanwhile, Corneille ordered his cavalry to sortie and kill Frederik Hendrik in a surprise attack, but his men were lured into a trap that killed nearly all. Meanwhile, the prince's health was declining so badly that he received special treatments from gout specialist Andreas Knofelius, personal physician to the Polish king. It was unclear if it helped. King Felipe was so eager for peace that he sent a Capuchin friar in warrior garb to Hulst to persuade the prince to agree to a settlement between Spain and the Republic. He barely mentioned religion and promised Frederik Hendrik all kinds of benefits for his person and house as long as he argued for peace in the States General. The prince told him, "Not without my allies." The monk left empty-handed. Governor-General Marquis de Castel Rodrigo also sent letter after letter asking for peace, but the states told him, "Go to Münster." On November 2nd, the prince sent a negotiator to claim Hulst. Corneille politely declined the request. They had plenty of ammo to keep the important city for a few more days, but many feared severe repercussions holding the town longer than necessary. The prince ordered a storm. On November 4th, 1645, after 18 days of relentless shelling, Corneille surrendered. What was left of the garrison went to Antwerp with full honors of war, 2 steel half-cannons and a mortar. With the capture of Hulst, Frederik Hendrik completed the defensive line of strategically located cities around the northern Netherlands. The prince went home, still dreaming of capturing Antwerp, while the French lost the Mardyck fort to the Spanish. On January 11, 1646, 8 Republican envoys, Adriaan Pauw among them, left for Münster, where the greatest, shrewdest, and craftiest statesmen were gathered to negotiate an end to 2 wars. King Felipe gave the Spanish negotiators, led by diplomat Gaspar de Bracamonte Guzman, Count of Peñaranda, extensive powers of attorney to end the war with his rebellious subjects. The negotiators didn't start from scratch. They used the agreements reached for the 1609 truce as the starting point, but France kept objecting to everything. Peñaranda, eager to move things along, fanned the flames of suspicion in the Dutch that the French were out to seize the Republic for themselves. He offered the states a separate peace, which started endless debates among the states. France, eager to keep the war going, offered the Prince of Orange 3,000 horse for 10 days for an attack on Antwerp, Bruges, or another big place. Despite Princess Amalia's vehement protest, Frederik Hendrik, a severely ill and broken man, joined his army and embarked at Dordrecht in the spring of 1646. Captain Ahab would catch his white whale, Antwerp. He declared, "I'd die in peace if I were lucky enough to seize that town." But the prince and his son Willem lingered in Breda for a long time. In England, the only remaining royalist field army was defeated at Stow-on-the-Wold. To avoid capture, Prince Charles, King Charles's heir, went into exile in France where his mom was. On May 5th, 1646, King Charles surrendered to the Scottish army at Newark. From his prison at Carisbrooke Castle on the Isle of Wight, Charles got right on exploiting the rift in Team Parliament. The MPs couldn't agree on government reform, religious freedoms, and the new model army, which had become a fierce political force. He also made a deal with the Scots, who now joined Team Royal. Early summer, Prince Frederik Hendrik suffered 2 strokes in 5 days, and he temporarily lost his ability to speak. He started acting like a child toward his wife, and invited an envoy to dance around his bedroom with him, saying this might be his last chance. Some think the stadtholder suffered from dementia. Still, Frederik Hendrik refused to hand over command to his son Willem, whom he considered unfit for duty. The French, who had grabbed Kortrijk, Sint-Winoksbergen-Veurne and Fort Mardyck again, got impatient. The Duke of Enghien was going after Dunkirk, so the states should send troops and ships, but the Republic worried that such a large enterprise would kill the peace talks. Meanwhile, Prince Frederik Hendrik, also risking peace, had recovered enough to advance his army on Antwerp with the promised 3,000 French horse plus an additional 3,000 French foot. In early August, he took the Molensteeg redoubt near Ghent, the castle at Temse, and the Boerengat redoubt, which put Antwerp in a tight spot. But those in Antwerp defended their town fiercely and drove the besiegers off with ships. The state's army abandoned everything. The French asked the Captain General to go to Flanders to check the Spanish. The moment the Dutch fleet arrived, they would besiege Dunkirk. September 17th, Lieutenant Admiral Tromp finally arrived to block the Dunkirk harbor, and the siege was on. The town surrendered a short month later, chaining those darn Dunkirk privateers at long last. Frederik Hendrik said adieu, doei, and marched his army to Venlo. They shot glowing cannonballs into the town and threatened a siege. Venlo was unimpressed. Since it was too late in the year to start trenches, everyone went to winter quarters. It was over. Amalia finally managed to convince her husband to desire peace. Frederik Hendrik never returned to the field, never captured his white whale Antwerp, or any other town. Hulst had been his final win. By the end of the year, Prince Frederik Hendrik's health was so bad he was unable to walk on the wedding day of his daughter Louise Henriette to Elector Friedrich Wilhelm von Brandenburg on December 7, 1646. He was carried into the banquet hall in a chair. F. Henri's life work had been accomplished. His father, Willem of Orange, had laid the foundation of the Republic. His brother Maurits had put up the walls. and Frederik Hendrik landed the roof. But his deep wish to see peace concluded remained unfulfilled. On March 14, 1647, Prince Frederik Hendrik of Orange died. He was 63 years old. On May 10th, a near-regal procession carried the prince's body to the Nieuwe Kerk in Delft to be placed in the Orange-Nassau Mausoleum with his father and brother. Frederik Hendrik's 21-year-old son Willem, as per the Acte de Survivance, succeeded him as stadtholder, and per the States General Decree of 1637 as Captain General and Admiral General. Things got a little hairy. It had been hammered into the kid from an early age that peace was bad and war was good for his authority and income. The French, not wanting peace, fanned the flames of young Willem's eagerness to wage war. The new Prince of Orange immediately sent an army to Hulst. The States of Holland were like, "Hey, what are you doing? Get back here!" Well, as Captain General, it was his duty to guard the borders. Besides, he only took orders from the States General. In response, Holland took its merry time swearing him in as their stadtholder, allowing the peace talks more time to wrap up. The final battle of the war was a sea battle. On June 10, 1647, 12 VOC ships attempted to capture Puerto de Cavite from the Spanish in the Philippines. Pampanga locals thwarted their landing, and the fleet was driven away with Spanish artillery. The VOC remained in Manila Bay and repeatedly assaulted the Spaniards and the locals until the end of the war. Meanwhile, in England, in an unprecedented verdict, a high court found King Charles guilty of attempting to uphold in himself an unlimited and tyrannical power to rule according to his will and to overthrow the rights and liberties of the people. King Charles was beheaded in Whitehall on January 30, 1649. The Scots crowned his son King Charles II, but England became a Commonwealth, with Oliver Cromwell at the helm as Lord Protector. For a little while, at least. Charles was in the Republic with his sister Mary Henrietta, plotting his return. In Münster, the talks between the Republic and Spain seemed to be headed for a 12 or 20-year truce. However, France refused to commit to continuing their support after a truce ended, and Holland kept insisting on ending the war. Eternal peace or bust. France did a million things to thwart all peace efforts. Things got so bad that they were eventually simply cut out of the talks. Most states agreed to conclude a separate peace without them. The peace, containing 79 points, was signed at Münster on January 30, 1648. Among other things, the Republic was officially recognized as a sovereign country, and all its territories were determined. King Felipe no longer considered the inhabitants of the Republic rebellious subjects. He nor his descendants would ever claim the lands again. The treaty was signed, but getting all the states to ratify all 79 points was like herding cats. Many cities worried about the consequences of angering France and the Prince of Orange, but should they continue the war after all of Spain's concessions only to benefit an unreliable and unreasonable France and its lapdog Willem? When the vote came down 5-2, Zeeland and Utrecht, the States of Holland argued that they should ratify the treaty by a majority vote instead of unanimously, and so it was done. On May 15, 1648, the treaty was ratified in a very solemn ceremony in the Great Hall of the Town Hall at Münster in front of a large crowd. The Dutch envoys took the oath by raising the front two fingers of the right hand. The Spanish envoys put their right hand on the Gospel with a silver cross on it. It was announced in Münster with trumpets, music and guns firing, and in the southern states, but not yet the Republic. Not until the lone holdout Zeeland realized it couldn't continue the war on its own. Then, on June 5, 1648, the proclamation of peace was announced in the Republic. There was a lot of rejoicing and praising God, though some reverends, fearing the return of the Roman Catholics, continued preaching about the benefits of war and the horrors of peace. The Treaty of Osnabrück ending the 30 Years' War took a little longer, but was made official on October 24, 1648, altering imperial power for good. The Treaty of Münster ended the Dutch Rebellion, War, Civil War, War of Independence. There had been much bloodshed and many lives lost, millions upon millions of guilders spent, and out of the ashes of burned and plundered cities arose a republic.